This is a ruler who has difficulty speaking, hearing, or seeing. He's got a huge protruding lower jaw and an abnormal amount of sexual urges. No offspring, so this poor guy never had any kids. It goes from 0, where they're not related at all, to 1, where it's an identical twin. For example, if 2 third cousins have kids, their inbreeding coefficient is 0.0. Well, he had 3 copies of an abnormal gene. He got 2 of them from his dad and 1 from his mom. Like Charles II, he suffered from seizures and other neurological problems. He had 2 copies of the abnormal gene. Ferdinand suffered from epilepsy, and he had really bad motor difficulties. She married her uncle, John, Duke of Braganza, also a first cousin, so his inbreeding coefficient was also 12.5%. Together they had 3 kids, one of whom died at age 4 months. 4 years later, Maria lost her mother and her favorite sister in an earthquake. Then she gave birth to twins. Sadly, they only survived a few days. Then her husband died. 3 years after that, Maria started having what seemed to be psychotic breaks. Sometimes she would think that people were witches sent to hurt her. During these episodes, she would yell and scream and pull out her hair. She also had trouble speaking, and she seemed confused and disoriented. Maria had been taking care of a small injured bird, and after it died, she wouldn't accept that it was dead. She kept feeling its heart to see if it was still beating. She also built little houses for mice and made tiny beds for worms. Later, she was exiled to a monastery where she lived out the rest of her days. She died believing that God was punishing her for her sins. She was known as Maria the Mad, and yet he was a pretty happy person. He enjoyed spending time with animals, and he loved to listen to birds. Well, one thing is that these rulers weren't just names on a page in a history book. They were real people dealing with a lot. These people weren't dumb or weak. They had intense drive and ambition. They just also happened to have genetic disorders. Another thing I take away from this is that while, yes, the main focus of this video was the negative outcomes of inbreeding, the reality was that these people were pretty resilient. Sure, some of them were crazy and violent, but others were incredibly smart and kind. Ferdinand I comes to mind. It seems like inbreeding didn't always result in imbeciles. Sometimes it resulted in geniuses. A third thing I take away from this is that these monarchs weren't the only ones suffering. Their families and their advisors and their entourages, everyone was suffering. Ferdinand was very curious about the world. He liked to feel textures and taste foods, and he liked to look at pictures. He was also a pretty nice guy. Even though he had a ton of limitations, he still wanted to make friends and connect with people. Ferdinand had a younger brother named Archduke Rudolf, who was born to first cousins. So his inbreeding coefficient was 12.5%. Rudolf shot himself in the head. Ferdinand became the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at age 24. But he wasn't able to do much. There were advisors running everything. He was known as the most passive of all the Habsburg emperors. He never married or had kids. Ferdinand's nephew, Archduke Albert, described him as being extremely limited in his abilities. He could understand what people were saying, but he could never reply correctly. He suffered from intense headaches and muscle spasms. His eyes rolled back in his head and he would drool uncontrollably. Ferdinand died at age 63. He was in a wheelchair, but he was at peace. According to his doctors, he died quietly in his sleep. People in Vienna liked Ferdinand. They saw him as a gentle and benign figure. He bit chunks of flesh off his arms and fingers, and he was pretty violent. Once he killed 4 courtiers during a fit. He also had a hard time controlling his bowels and bladder. So his father, King Philip II, ordered for him to be locked up in a dungeon where he spent the last 8 years of his life. Unlike Charles II, though, Don Carlos only had 2 copies of the abnormal gene. That's because his parents were first cousins, so their inbreeding coefficient was 12.5%, not nearly as much as Charles II's parents. One of the things that happens because of this is that your immune system becomes weaker. That meant he was way more susceptible to skin diseases. And one theory as to why he didn't have any kids is that these extra copies of this abnormal gene negatively affected his sperm. It also seems to have affected his brain. Charles II was known as Charles the Bewitched. Back then, they thought he was mentally unstable because of witchcraft. So they even tortured him, trying to figure out who put a curse on him. They found no evidence of witchcraft, but they did find a lot of evidence of inbreeding. 6.5%. If 2 first cousins have kids, their inbreeding coefficient is 12.5%. Half siblings, 25%. First-degree cousins, 50%. And identical twins, once again, 100%. You can actually calculate this pretty easily. At one point, he took a liking to a young page boy and forcefully tried to hug him. They're pretty infamous for their pretty extreme cases of inbreeding. Let's look at Charles II of Spain. Charles II had a ton of problems. He couldn't speak well. He had trouble hearing and seeing. He had really bad acne and sores. He had a hard time controlling his bowels. He also had violent mood swings. He wasn't able to produce offspring. And he lived a very isolated life. Charles II was a product of 2 lineages, both of which were pretty prone to incest. The Spanish and the Austrian Habsburg. On his mother's side, his great-grandparents were brother and sister. His mother was a double first cousin of her husband. both of her parents were first cousins. So on his father's side, both of his great-grandparents were first cousins. His grandmother was also a first cousin of her husband. His mom was a first cousin of her husband, and his parents were first cousins. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient was 0.6333, and he wasn't the only one in his family with a high inbreeding coefficient. Charles I of Spain, his great-grandfather, was 0.667. His grandfather was 0.5, his father was 0.3, and his mother was 0.312. Welcome to my channel. Today we'll be answering the prompt, what did the inbreeding of European monarchies throughout history actually look like? For centuries, many European monarchies practiced a form of inbreeding, which is when close relatives marry each other. For example, first cousins, or uncles and nieces. They interbred to preserve power and prestige and to maintain what they believed was a pure bloodline. But there are some pretty wild things that happened as a result of this. First, let's talk about the science behind it. When you have two copies of the same recessive gene, that's when you get certain recessive disorders. And you get one copy of a gene from each parent. Now, if both parents are related, say half-siblings, then they have more of a chance of passing along the same recessive genes to their kids, which means those kids will end up with two copies of that recessive gene, and thus, they're more likely to develop a certain disorder. Now, scientists use something called an inbreeding coefficient to show how genetically related to people are before they have kids. Let's start with the Habsburg family. So what was it about Charles II's makeup that was so screwed up? Don Carlos is another example. Don Carlos was the son of King Philip II of Spain. Then there's Ferdinand I of Austria. Ferdinand was born to double first cousins, so his inbreeding coefficient was 25%. There's also Maria of Portugal. Maria was born to first cousins, so her inbreeding coefficient was 12.5%. She had two copies of the abnormal gene. So what do I take away from this? I hope you learned something today. If you want to watch another video about weird royalty, then click right here. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.